Hey, welcome to the show today. So, based on user input, we actually have a paper on neuroscience that we looked into today. The paper's title is Implied Motion as a Possible Mechanism for Encoding Other People's Attention. The researchers that did this paper were Arvid Guterstam and Michael Graziano. This is a really cool episode because we actually got to interview Arvid and talked with him a bit. We're going to be throwing in some snippets from that interview in this episode, and hopefully you guys like the episode as much as we like doing it. I'm Hunter.
And I'm Luke, and you're listening to Epistem, a show where we explore papers in STEM fields and let you know what they're all about. So I'm going to start by painting a picture for you. If I showed you an image of a cheetah right now, with no context at all about what the cheetah just did, or what it was about to do, or where it was going, you would still most likely be able to tell me if it was moving when the picture was taken. And that's probably obvious sounding because for us, it pretty much is. Cheetahs look a lot different when they're running and when they're sitting still. But even though a picture doesn't move, you can tell that the cheetah was moving, and you can even tell in what direction. And this sounds pretty intuitive, and it is for most people. We as people have the ability to discern motion even from a static image. This is what is often referred to as implied motion, and it turns out to play a big role in how our brains perceive the world around us. If you consider early humans, for example, who survived by hunting and avoiding predators, you can probably imagine how understanding and predicting motion would be a useful skill. But as humans advanced, it also became increasingly useful to understand and predict things like feelings and attitudes towards each other. So somewhere along this evolution of the way our brains interpret the world around us, we may have started adapting this neural mechanism of implied motion for other uses. In this episode, we'll look into how implied motion has anything to do at all with interpersonal psychology, and how researchers at Princeton were able to find out. Long before this research article was published, academics understood the benefit that could come along with a greater understanding of the inner workings of the human mind. There's a whole lot of fields devoted to this, obviously, like psychology, psychiatry, there's neuroscience, sociology, and all that stuff.
Nowadays, people are even relating brain studies to things that you wouldn't even consider to be related in neuroscience, such as brain studies being used for the development of technology to be able to control technology with impulses from the brain. There is a lot of research going on in an immense amount of fields right now related to the brain, and I think that over the next few years and maybe in the next few months we're going to be finding some good research papers to delve into.
I agree. That would be ideal. Regardless, what the Princeton researchers are most interested in here is attention. But more specifically, how does one person perceive the attention of another person? Or in other words, how does attention even work really on a neuroscience level?
My name is Arvid Guterstam. I'm MD PhD. I'm currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton.
Arvid is one of the researchers who wrote this paper. The lab he works with focuses on something called the attention schema theory.
Very briefly, the attention schema theory says that awareness is very intimately related to attention. Namely, awareness is like a control system of attention. The brain subconsciously is building models of attention and attention of other people. So these models could very well be practical examples of attention schemas existing in the brain.
Some previous research that's been done at the lab that Arvid works at has shown that attention is perceived as a physical force that leaves the attender's eyes, travels through space, and gently pushes on the object of attention.
So, could you explain that in, I guess, simpler terms?
Oh, yeah, sure. So another way that it's explained a lot is like as a liquid, as a stream, like a water gun or something like that coming out, just based on the way that our brain, I guess by looking at the brain signals, based on the way that our brain responds to visual stimulus. It's the same way with like attention stimulus, if that makes sense. It's also been shown that we can instinctively tell the source of the attention as well. And by that I mean whether someone is internally deciding to give something their attention, or if the object caught their attention, such as like a loud noise or a smell or something like that. What they wanted to know in this experiment was something more about the nature of how attention works. Specifically, they wanted to know if a static image of a face gazing at something would induce the same type of response that a moving object would. But how would you test that, and what would it mean really?
What we use is what we call random dot motion. It has been used since the 1970s, and it's a very established measure and very, very sensitive. And this is built on what we call the motion after effect, or the waterfall illusion. Let's say you look at a waterfall for 60 seconds. It's a lot of motion in the visual field going down. And then you turn away and you look at some static object. And it will actually appear as if that static object is moving in the opposite direction. And that's the waterfall illusion. And using random dot motion, we're actually measuring the same phenomenon, but in a much, much more sensitive way. So in our study here, in this series of experiments, they're all built on the same simple idea, that you have a face that's attending or not attending to an object. And when that face is attending to an object, we're trying to see if there is a waterfall effect in this empty space between the face and the object. We know that people in general are very easily read other people's minds. You can, even when you speak on the phone with someone, you can, and also blind people, you can, you build a representation immediately of where the other person's attention is. And it turns out that we have found this mechanism that seems as if the brain uses visual motion in a way that wasn't anticipated.
Our brains love saving energy, and as they evolved over time, one of the ways they did this was by adapting pre-existing neural systems instead of developing entirely new ones. This is kind of like buying a set of Legos that can be assembled into a toy truck, but then reusing those pieces to build a car or a small building, and then maybe adding or making small changes to parts along the way. The same fundamental pieces are used for a different application.
Similar to a past series that we were doing with CRISPR. CRISPR uses a similar method of gene adaptation, where CRISPR evolved over time, and that's why people are using it nowadays as a method of gene editing. It's because evolution takes so long to occur. We want to, as humans, utilize that same thing in a biomimicry sense. And the body itself, or an organism itself, wants to reuse anything it's already adapted and then utilize it for other means if it can.
Right. The process of evolving a system or mechanism takes millions of years, the life of the entire species, but adaptation, the nature of it is small changes, small mutations in genetics that bring about a change that's positive or negative, right? Mm-hmm. So they theorize with the motion adaptation theory that our model of attention, our implicit model of attention, how we perceive attention and how we build those models in our head, is an adaptation of the way we perceive motion.
Okay.
And that's part of what this paper is all about. So just to reiterate, part of this experiment was to test if our model of attention was built in the same way by using the mechanisms of an older neural system. People don't literally shoot attention out of their eyes, but the brain seems to process it that way. It doesn't have to be a particularly accurate system as long as it works. It begs the question, does this happen very often in the brain?
It happens a lot that there's no, the brain doesn't necessarily need a representation of the world that is as close to reality as possible. It just needs a representation of the world that's beneficial for survival. If you take the perception of our own body, for instance, it's very easy to manipulate that perception, even though it would take the feeling of this sense of body ownership for granted. You can very easily, with these simple tricks like the rubber hand illusion, maybe you're familiar with it, you can easily trick the brain that a rubber hand is part of your own body, which tells us that these inner models of the body and the world are very malleable and dynamic. And they probably are like that because it has been computationally efficient for the brain when you need to build this fast and pragmatic representation of the world.
Let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll touch on some applications and get into the details of the procedure a little bit more.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the pretty strange mechanisms through which the brain operates. So having a greater knowledge of these systems of perception and mechanisms of the brain could conceivably shed some light on developmental issues, especially in young people or children. It's too early to say how this motion adaptation effect presents itself in a developing brain, simply because the studies haven't been done yet. The effect may not even fully present itself for the first several years of life, or they may present themselves in an entirely different manner. But there are other applications we can consider.
So it might be the case that this system is affected in people with psychiatric disorders that goes with decreased social functioning, like autism, for instance, or schizophrenia. So that's something that will be really interesting to look at from a clinical point of view.
I think it's about time to jump into the nerd notes and get into how this experiment itself, how the procedure went. So in the research study, it was a series of 7 tests. The first test was the control. So with this test, subjects were sat in front of a screen and were shown a succession of slides, for lack of a better word. On one of the slides, there would be a series of dots moving across the screen in a particular direction, and the one immediately after it would be a smaller series of dots, either moving in the same direction or after. And what they find is that the direction of the first screen affects your response time on the second screen. So specifically, if the second screen is moving in the same direction as the first screen, you respond a lot slower than if it's moving in the opposite direction. In subsequent experiments, they replaced that first screen with a static image including a face. Now what this face was doing was different in all the other 6 experiments. Sometimes it was looking at a tree, sometimes it was blindfolded, sometimes it was facing the opposite direction. Each experiment was a little bit different. Sometimes it wasn't a face at all, sometimes it was an arrow or a flashlight or something like that. The point is to see if the static image has the same effect on your response time in the second screen as the moving field of dots. One of the things they found was that when the eyes were covered up, the motion adaptation effect wasn't there. So the eyes play some critical role in how we perceive attention, and that seems fairly obvious. They didn't see the same effect with the flashlight. In one of the experiments, and I found this pretty interesting, instead of the static image on the first screen directing visual attention, they were told it was directing auditory attention to the other side of the screen. So in other words, it was listening to something on the other side of the screen. And with this, they found the same effect. So even when a face is blindfolded, people still perceive attention, even auditory attention, as an object that's moving from the attending agent to the attended agent.
That's a really interesting point. I think something that's very prominent in this research and a lot of neuroscience research is the large difference between nurture and nature in the learning process of humans and other animals. As Sigmund Freud once said, perception is less of a recording system and more of a protection system against external stimuli, therefore leading to the assumption that things are more nature rather than nurture. But some would argue one way or the other, or I personally believe that it's a good, healthy mix of both. There's a lot of factors that affect pretty much any way that you receive stimuli. The brain is more prone to follow an external stimuli, as Freud said, which I think is very crucial to the nature aspect of this, because as early humans, we had to be aware of our surroundings more often than not, in case there were predators lurking, in case we needed to hunt and find a prey, or so on and so forth. There are many applications that we would need to follow the external stimuli, and I think that this study also sort of leads to the same conclusion, that we want to follow other stimuli if they are moving in the opposite direction or just catching our perception where we need it to.
Right, it's pretty interesting just thinking about how the relationship between external and internal factors when it comes to consciousness, right? Because like you just said, so much of what happens in our brain is dependent on what we're perceiving in the world around us. But so much of it also comes from within, our own images of ourselves, our thoughts. We kind of build a world inside of our heads and use our senses to verify that world.
Yeah, just bringing it back to Freud again, I believe he was one of the first to actually bring up, or maybe he was the first to do the description of ego and id in the neuroscience field and the psychology field. Ego refers to your outward personality, while id is what you are and what you self-identify as.
I gotcha. So a second note that I made about this paper was that the test relied heavily on subjects' ability to detect random dot motion. So they couldn't just take anybody that signed up, so to speak. They had to qualify subjects for the test. If they weren't sufficiently accurate or consistent, it was decided that their response data would not be reliable and they would be excluded from the experiment. So that's pretty much all of the nerd notes that I had for this one. I hope you all found this information as interesting as I did, and I'm happy to report that the research being done on this stuff is still going on into the future.
So what we're working on now is seeing if we can create an experiment where with involving faces and objects and then a lot of motion in the background, and see if we can contaminate this background motion with very, very subtle, imperceptible eye beams of motion, so to say, and see if that affects those hidden motion signals. Do they affect people's social cognitive decisions about which faces are attending which objects? If that's the case, then we would have causal evidence that motion, these hidden motion signals, play an important role for perceiving other people's attention.
Hopefully in the future, we will get the chance to update you all again with the next discovery in the neuroscience of attention and awareness.
Well, that concludes the episode for today. We had a great time actually learning about neuroscience, changing up our field of study a little bit. It was a really cool paper, and we're going to try to reach out to more researchers and more professors in the future for doing interviews and trying to keep a similar style of recording and a similar style of interviewing and more guest appearances in the show. We would also like to give a special thanks to Arvid Guderstam for actually meeting with us and talking about the paper more. That was very crucial to this paper's process, and I think that we will be doing something similar in the future, and we really enjoyed this interview style, so we're going to continue to do that, and thank you again, Arvid. Again, the paper is called Implied Motion as a Possible Mechanism for Encoding Other People's Attention. It was researched and written by Arvid Guderstam and Michael Graziano. The paper can be found in the Elsevier Journal under the category of Progress in Neurobiology. This paper was first made available March 23rd, 2020, so it's a pretty current neuroscience paper, and we're hoping to look, as Luke said, we're hoping to look more into similar research in the future. Thank you again for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or want to just let us know about some feedback, as always, email us at epistem.pod@gmail.com. Also, give us a like and follow our posts on Instagram. That is at epi.stem. Also, if you're feeling generous and want to help us out, go to our Patreon at patreon.com/epistem. Thank you for all your support, and continue on your research journey.